Arman Tsarukyan creates a problem that feels backward. Against him, doing more doesn't fix anything. Pushing pace doesn't open doors. Increasing volume doesn't tilt momentum. In fact, the harder fighters work, the more the fight slips away from them. And that contradiction is the entire story. Most fighters are trained to believe effort is leverage. If the opponent won't break, you press harder. If exchanges stall, you raise tempo. If control feels uncertain, you force it. Against Arman Tsarukyan, that logic quietly fails. Not in a dramatic collapse, not through obvious dominance, but through accumulation. Fighters look active, they look committed, they look like they're doing the right things. And yet, every increase in effort seems to make their position worse. This video is not about Arman's athleticism or technical skill set. It's about why effort becomes a liability when facing him. Why fighters who normally thrive by outworking opponents suddenly look rushed, inefficient, and trapped. Why the fight begins to punish urgency instead of rewarding it. Against Arman, energy doesn't translate into advantage, it translates into exposure. What makes this especially dangerous is how normal it feels at first. Nothing appears wrong. The opponent isn't overwhelmed. The pace feels manageable. The exchanges don't look lopsided, but minute by minute, the cost of every additional action rises. Every scramble takes more out than it gives back. Every attempt to assert control shortens the margin for error. The fighter working harder feels productive right up until the moment the fight turns decisively against him. Arman Tsarukyan doesn't need to chase outcomes. He lets opponents manufacture them. He allows pressure to exist, then converts it into fatigue, misjudgment, and forced decisions. By the time fighters realize their effort is being used against them, the structure of the fight has already been set. By the end of this video, the question won't be why Arman Tsarukyan is dangerous. It will be why so many fighters discover too late that the one thing they trusted most inside the cage, relentless effort, is exactly what makes fighting him worse. The first thing fighters misunderstand about Arman Tsarukyan is where the danger actually lives. It's not in explosive moments or sudden chaos. It's an effort without return. Against most opponents, increasing pace creates pressure. Pressure forces reactions. Reactions open mistakes. Against Arman, that chain breaks at the very first link. Pace doesn't bend the fight, it feeds it. Early in the fight, opponents often feel encouraged. They're moving well, they're engaging. Exchanges feel competitive. Nothing is being shut down aggressively. That's exactly what tempts them to invest more. A longer scramble, a harder push on the fence, a faster reset into another exchange. Each decision feels reasonable in isolation. Together, they start draining resources that won't be replenished. Arman doesn't resist work. He absorbs it structurally. He matches effort just enough to prevent escape, but never enough to escalate risk. Fighters believe they are setting a rhythm. In reality, they are accepting one. The more they try to raise the tempo, the more they discover that the fight isn't speeding up, it's thickening. Movements require more energy, transitions feel heavier, timing starts to slip. This is where the trap becomes visible, but not obvious. Opponents don't feel dominated, they feel busy. Busy without progress, busy without payoff. And because nothing catastrophic happens early, they double down. They work harder, convinced that the breakthrough is one exchange away. But Arman doesn't give breakthroughs, he gives friction. Every added action against him carries a small tax. A scramble that doesn't resolve cleanly. A takedown attempt that costs more than it earns. A burst of activity that forces recovery without reward. Fighters rarely notice these taxes, accumulating until the account is already overdrawn. By the end of the round, they haven't lost control, they've lost efficiency. And efficiency is the currency that decides fights at this level. Arman hasn't taken anything yet. He doesn't need to. The opponent has already committed to a version of the fight where success is measured by effort instead of effect. And once that commitment is made, working harder stops being a solution. It becomes the problem. As the fight settles, opponents begin to notice something unsettling about Arman Tsarukyan. The pace feels high, but the fight isn't moving anywhere. This is where Arman's real advantage shows up. He creates a false sense of tempo, a rhythm that feels demanding without actually advancing the fight toward resolution. Fighters think they're pushing the action forward, but they're really running in place. Against most opponents, effort produces visible reactions. Pressure forces retreats. Volume creates openings. Scrambles lead to positional reward. Against Arman, effort produces maintenance. Positions change without advantage. Exchanges reset without consequence. The opponent is constantly working just to stay even. That's a dangerous place to be, because staying even costs more energy than getting ahead. This false tempo tricks fighters into self-sabotage. They feel the fight slipping, not because they're losing exchanges, but because nothing they do seems to stick. That feeling pushes them to increase output again. More entries, more scrambles, more attempts to take over. But Arman never responds by matching intensity. He responds by making effort expensive. He keeps engagements long enough to tax the body, then disengages before risk appears. What makes this especially damaging is that fatigue doesn't arrive as exhaustion. It arrives as delay. Reactions slow by fractions of a second. Entries lose sharpness. Transitions take longer to complete. Fighters still feel capable, but their margin for error has quietly evaporated. And because Arman isn't forcing mistakes, opponents don't realize they're being set up. Game plans begin to decay here. Coaches usually expect escalation to solve stalls. Against Arman, escalation accelerates decay. Fighters abandon patience, not because they're losing badly, but because the fight feels unresolved. That unresolved tension becomes pressure they put on themselves. Arman never has to demand urgency, his opponent supplies it. By the end of this phase, the opponent has worked harder than expected and gained less than planned. The body isn't broken, but the budget is gone. From this point forward, every action has to be chosen carefully, and that's exactly where Arman thrives. He hasn't taken control. He's simply ensured that working harder will only make the remaining decisions worse. By the midpoint of the fight, opponents stop asking how to win exchanges against Arman Tsarukyan and start asking a quieter question: which efforts are actually worth the cost? That question marks the real turning point, because the moment fighters begin to self-limit, the fight tilts irreversibly. Nothing obvious has gone wrong. There's no visible damage, no dramatic momentum swing, but the internal calculus has changed. Fighters realize that every scramble feels longer than expected, every reset takes more out than it should, and every push forward risks burning energy without payoff. So they edit themselves, they shorten combinations, they hesitate on entries, they disengage a half-second earlier than instinct would normally allow. Not because they're afraid, because they're trying to be efficient. That's the trap. Efficiency against Arman is not neutral, it's restrictive. When fighters reduce output to preserve energy, they also reduce pressure diversity. The fight becomes predictable without becoming passive. Arman doesn't need to chase, he reads. He doesn't need to escalate, he selects. As opponents narrow their choices to safe actions, those actions become easier to time, easier to anticipate, and easier to neutralize. The attempt to conserve resources quietly hands him informational control. This is where effort becomes a liability in a new way. Earlier, working harder drained the tank. Now, working less shrinks options. The opponent is caught between two bad strategies: spend energy to create nothing, or conserve energy and create even less. Arman lives comfortably in that gap. He keeps engagements just active enough to prevent full rest, just structured enough to punish overcommitment, and just open enough to invite mistakes from impatience. Fatigue now shows up as decision friction. Fighters take longer to choose. They circle instead of entering. They wait for moments that never arrive. Their corners urge action, but action without a clear return feels irresponsible. Arman never forces this hesitation. He simply maintains a pace where hesitation feels rational. By the end of this phase, the opponent hasn't been outworked or outgunned. He's been outbudgeted. The fight has become a series of constrained choices, and Arman controls the exchange rate. Every meaningful attempt costs more than it gives back. And once a fighter realizes that, the instinct to work harder is gone for good. From here on, the fight doesn't hinge on who wants it more. It hinges on who can still afford to act. And against Arman Tsarukyan, that answer is rarely the fighter who tried to outwork him early. This is the moment where opponents finally understand they have to force something and realize that forcing it now is the worst possible option. Against Arman Tsarukyan, late realization doesn't create clarity. It creates desperation filtered through restraint. Fighters know they can't coast anymore, but they also know that reckless effort earlier in the fight is exactly what put them here. So they try to gamble carefully, and careful gambling doesn't exist. At this stage, the opponent begins to test risk in fragments. A harder entry without full commitment. A longer exchange that stops short of collapse. A takedown attempt that's abandoned early to avoid being stuck underneath. Each attempt is half-measured, designed to probe without paying full cost. Arman reads this instantly. He doesn't need to sprawl explosively or counter-aggressively. He simply lets these attempts fail cleanly. No scramble, no chaos, just denial. What's important here is that Arman doesn't punish the attempt itself. He punishes the idea behind it. The opponent is trying to break the fight open without fully accepting the consequences. Arman's structure makes that impossible. Every partial commitment ends with the same message. If you want something meaningful, you'll have to risk everything. And that message lands repeatedly until the opponent stops trying to negotiate. This creates a psychological standoff. The fighter knows time is running out. He knows judges reward moments, but he also knows that the only available moments now are high risk, high cost, and likely irreversible. Against most opponents, this is where chaos saves fights. Against Arman, chaos has been priced out of the market. Fatigue compounds the problem. Not exhaustion, selective fatigue. The kind where explosive effort still exists, but recovery no longer does. Fighters can surge once, maybe twice, but they can't afford to miss. That makes every attempt heavier, slower, more obvious. Arman stays calm because he's not reacting to speed, he's reacting to intent. And intent, at this stage, is loud. This is where viewers often misread the fight. They see an opponent pushing late and assume momentum is shifting. Inside the cage, it feels completely different. Every failed attempt confirms what the fighter already suspects. The window to change the fight has closed. There is no reset coming, no second wind that solves the structural problem. The fight isn't slipping away, it's already settled. Arman doesn't need to seal the fight dramatically here. He just needs to not give anything back. He stays efficient, disciplined, and selective. He lets the opponent burn what little leverage remains. And by the time the final minutes arrive, the effort that once felt like a weapon now feels like dead weight. This is why working harder against Arman Tsarukyan makes things worse. Because by the time you realize you need to force the fight, the only force left available is the kind that destroys you faster than it helps. By the final phase of the fight, the opponent no longer believes effort can save him. Against Arman Tsarukyan, that realization doesn't trigger a breakthrough. It triggers collapse in slow motion. The fighter understands, clearly now, that every previous attempt to work harder only reduced his options. What remains is a narrow corridor where any decisive action carries permanent cost. This is where Arman's advantage becomes absolute. He has not controlled the fight in the conventional sense, but he has controlled the exchange rate. Every meaningful attempt now costs more energy, more exposure, and more risk than it did earlier. The opponent feels boxed in by his own history inside the fight. The more he tried to solve the problem with effort, the fewer solutions remain. Late surges look different here. They're not explosive, they're strained. Movements lose snap. Entries telegraph intent. The opponent isn't slow, he's predictable. And predictability is exactly what Arman has been waiting for. He doesn't need to dominate exchanges. He only needs to deny resolution. Each defended attempt reinforces the same message. The fight can't be forced anymore. What's devastating is that Arman never has to raise his level. He stays consistent, precise, and selective. He lets the opponent spend what little leverage remains. Any success the opponent finds is momentary and costly. It doesn't chain, it doesn't build. It evaporates the moment Arman resets the structure. By now, the opponent's corner is asking for urgency. But urgency without options is just noise. The fighter knows it. That knowledge slows him more than fatigue ever could. He hesitates at the edge of commitment because he understands the price. and because the clock has become an enemy that won't negotiate. The fight doesn't end with a dramatic takeover. It ends with inevitability. Arman has turned the opponent's best instinct to work harder into the very mechanism that sealed the outcome. Not through force, through structure. Arman Tsarukyan doesn't beat fighters by overwhelming them. He beats them by letting effort betray them. He creates a fight where activity feels productive early, expensive in the middle, and destructive at the end. The harder opponents push, the faster their margin disappears. That's the lesson. Against Arman, effort is not leverage unless it produces effect. Pace is not pressure unless it creates consequence. And once fighters realize that their work has been fueling the problem instead of solving it, the fight has already been decided. This is why working harder against Arman Tsarukyan makes it worse. Because by the time you understand the trap, the only thing left to spend is the one resource you can't get back choice.